we'll do a welcome. We're joined today by some very experts on the topic of ESG, and including my colleague Katie from Amsterdam, who is now awake at 5:30 a.m. So it shows a true commitment to join this. Actually, it's the kickoff event of our series of results events across the globe. So we're very proud to have the honor here in Oceania. Well, Katie probably will consume some coffee. I guess we can start the event. Over to you, Arvind.
Thank you, Ruben. Good afternoon and welcome to today's session. Before we get started, I would like to acknowledge the traditional owners and custodians of the land on which we convene this event. Today, I'm on the land of Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and I would like to pay my respects to all elders, past, present, and emerging, and extend this respect to Aboriginal and Torres Strait people from other communities who may also be on the call today. Thank you all for joining the GRESB 2020 Infrastructure Results event, Oceania. My name is Arvind Sharma, and I'm Technical Director, Sustainability at GST, one of the world's leading professional services firm operating in the global markets of water, energy and resources, environment, property and buildings, and transportation. Leveraging our strong understanding of business and their assets, we assist clients to make investments and business decisions that support their strategy and sustainability goals, while also seeking to improve the physical, natural, and social environments where we operate. Through our ESG advisory work, we are able to see that a proactive approach to ESG creates increased investment returns. So we are delighted to be co-hosting this event with GRESB. We will provide insights into environmental, social, and governance performance of infrastructure portfolios in Oceania. Like you all, I'm looking forward to an engaging dialogue around the fast emerging trends facing our industry, such as resilience, climate change mitigation and adaptation, sustainable finance, and ESG frameworks. Just a few housekeeping rules before I invite Ainsley. We are very keen to interact with you and invite you to pose questions through Q&A chat function. We will answer them during the Q&A portion of the session at the end of each presentation and towards the end of panel discussion. This session will be recorded and a copy will be made available on GRESB webpage. If you experience any issues in hearing or video, please let us know. Now, I would like to take this time to shine the spotlight on Ainsley Simpson, CEO, Infrastructure Sustainability Council of Australia. Ainsley.
Thank you, Arvind. Good afternoon, kia ora koutou katoa. My name is Ainsley Simpson. I am the CEO of the Infrastructure Sustainability Council of Australia. I'm coming to you from my home in Darug country. This week here in Australia, we embrace the true history of this country, a history which dates back thousands of generations. During NAIDOC Week, we are celebrating the oldest continuing culture on the planet, over 65,000 years. We also honour the invaluable certainty that comes from adaptation and intimate knowledge of country, which can enable the endurance of climate change, raging bushfires, and destructional floods and droughts. Always was, always will be, acknowledges that we all have much to learn to sustainably provide for our collective future. It's really hard to believe that it's been a year since we last gathered to share the annual GRESB benchmark results, but here we are, this time not overlooking the smoky Sydney Harbour, but instead we meet virtually. Now we all share in not one, but two universal challenges: addressing climate change and the effects of COVID. There is a growing evidence base that the effects of COVID have fanned the flames of ESG, underpinned by the long-term dividends that broader outcomes and non-market values return. The world over, infrastructure will be the lever for economic recovery. The infrastructure decisions we are making with urgency and good reason today will be with us for the next 50 and 100 years. So let's not fall foul of the familiar and suffer the repetition of short-sightedness. Instead, let's build back by expanding our horizons to the period for which our decisions last, which is well beyond our unit of measure, oftentimes the unit of one, you or me, or our own life expectancies. Today, we'll hear more about the outcomes from the 2020 GRESB survey and explore the action necessary over the next decade. I would be surprised, but it's likely to include things like transparency and strengthening of sustainability disclosures and governance, how the ESGs are being embedded in investment and corporate strategy, how TCFD is being implemented, and the opportunities to accelerate readiness across our sector. And more than likely, about the growing impediment to honour our commitments towards the Paris Agreement. ISCA has been thrilled to see our members and rated assets leverage the ISCA-GRESB partnership through this year's reporting cycle, particularly the performance component. It really highlights the importance of credible frameworks that support directors and executives mitigate and cap on risk and capitalize on opportunities. Frameworks that support institutional and retail investors make informed decisions, and greater coordination of frameworks that harmonize standards and acceptance levels when measuring what matters. So congratulations to all the participants this year, to GRESB on 5 years of infrastructure assessment, as well as your continued growth in participation, but also impact. I'll hand over to the GRESB team now to take us through this year's results.
Great. Hi, good morning for me and good afternoon/evening for all of you. Thank you so much for joining. I'm joining from Amsterdam. So I've tried to keep it down on the coffee so I don't go too fast. So thank you all for being. Here's just a reminder of our program for today. So yeah. So we just had our introduction and welcome. So what I'll be doing now is I'll run through the results for this year and give you the summary of those. So first of all, finally, it's coming to an end, 2020. I think I'll speak for quite a lot of people when I say that. It's been an intense year, but luckily it's also been an interesting year for ESG, not just from obviously the COVID perspective, but also from the perspective of seeing participation growth despite that in GRESB. And we're seeing very interesting things happening in the results, which I can't wait to show you right now. So let's get to that. So we've now had 5 years of GRESB infrastructure, which is amazing. It's really showing how much the industry is buying into infrastructure and ESG. And I think right now we're finally really starting to see some interesting trends happening, and we can start drawing some conclusions to that, which is always very exciting. So without further ado, this year's participation has increased, which we are all very pleased about, because there were some moments in the spring, and I'm probably not the only one who would expect that to see some participants coming to us and saying, we're very struggling to get our reporting teams together. We're managing crises, especially in particular asset classes. We're really seeing issues with getting our data together, but still we saw an increase in reporting this year, which we're incredibly proud of. And we're working obviously with the industry this year to make sure everyone was able to report and to provide additional support with that. And we saw an increase in reporting among the fund side of around 10%, but not just in overall participation, which is the bottom chart here, but also in the number of funds that are participating with a substantial part of their underlying portfolio, which allows them to obtain a GRESB score. So that's a really wonderful increase that we're seeing there. And also the portion of the fund's assets that are actually participating has also increased this year, which is the bottom right graph here to the right, which is really exciting. And we saw that trend globally, but we also saw that trend here in Oceania, where there was an increase in the number of funds, and there was an increase in the number of funds who completed both components and had a GRESB score. So wonderful news for that front. So that's the fund assessment. Now I'll just quickly move over to the asset assessment. Again, we saw an increase, which we were at some point quite wondering whether that was even possible. We would have been very happy if it had stabilized, but we were very, very pleased to see that it actually increased. And a lot of that increase came globally. There weren't specific continents where the growth was a lot stronger, although we did see quite an increase here in Asia, as you can see here. And Oceania grew as well. So we now have 55 assets reporting across Oceania, of which 48 are in Australia and 7 in New Zealand. So that's really wonderful, and we're very glad to see also such a great turnout today, and reflecting the number of participants that we have across the region. So on our next slide, we'll go into a bit more detail on this, where you can see a sector breakdown. As you can see, some of the sectors had a bit of a stagnation in growth, which is to be expected. So for example, the transport sector and the social infra sector didn't grow or even decreased a little bit this year. But do note that obviously in the transport sector, we have a lot of airports who very much struggle to report. In the social infrastructure sector contains hospitals for similar reasons, very much doing other things during the reporting season than reporting to GRESB. Yet still, we saw quite a lot of assets responding, which we were very glad of, and very happy to see that despite the crises at hand, people still committed to participating in GRESB and reporting their data. So we're very glad to see that. Now, if we go to the next part, so I've just showed you our participation. We'll now talk a little bit about scores. So just to start with the regional scores, you can see here that scores were quite stable across the globe in terms of differences between continents. Although Oceania, again, as usual, if you've been to one of these events before, you know that Oceania typically does quite well with these things and has fairly high scores, and again, one of the higher scores globally. Do note that that very high number for globally diversified that you see here in the bottom left contains not that many assets. So the number gets skewed quite easily. So with one very high performing asset, that number goes up quite a lot. And similarly, we're not displaying any data for Africa, and that's not because we don't have any entities participating, but it's because we don't have enough to show you an average that couldn't be reverse engineered by someone to figure out what score the other asset on their continent had. So for confidentiality reasons, we can't display that. So yeah, overall, the average score for Australia was 70, and the average score in New Zealand was 60. And the number of facilities worldwide, which so we have obviously assets and then underlying facilities, and that number was 1,354 in 2020, which was a 20% increase compared to 2019. So that was really fantastic to see that also more facilities are reporting, and to see that uptick, because that means we can ultimately start doing better benchmarking as well. There we go, and then up to the next slide. So we'll go to the fund model, and I'll do a quick recap for everyone that we changed our scoring model slightly this year. So we now have the GRESB score total, which is composed of a figure of a score that has been awarded to the management component and a score for the performance component. And the score for the performance component for funds depends on the underlying assets. So a fund obtains a score for the performance component if over 25% of their assets participate in the asset assessment. And those scores get aggregated based on GAV and then create the fund performance score. And the management score obviously depends on the score awarded in the fund assessments management component. So the 2019 and earlier numbers that you can see on the chart are not entirely applicable, because some of those numbers are obviously depending on slightly different indicators, but they do give a rough idea of where the industry is moving. So we do want to display them to show you what's going on here. So as you can see, the global average has increased in 2020, which is a really great trend because it means that transparency and disclosure is improving across the board. And you can see that as well with the number of entities sort of moving towards the top here and starting to move towards that hallowed top right corner over here. And the little lines that you can see are the quintile lines. So all of the assets are divided into 1 of 5 quintiles, and that affects their GRESB score. So if you're in the top right quintile, you get a 5-star GRESB rating. And if you're in the bottom left quintile, you get a 1-star GRESB rating. Now, I also want to point out these little gray dots here on the left-hand side, which are all of the funds that didn't have enough underlying assets to obtain, participate in the asset assessment, I should say, to obtain a performance score. So they get 0 on the performance component, which is why they're all clustered here on the y-axis. So they did complete the management component. That's what they have had points for. So hope you're all still with me. This is the fund model. The asset model looks very similar. So, oh, sorry, I forgot this slide was in there as well. My apologies. Obviously, the Oceania assets, funds are in here as well. So you can see where Oceania is. And overall, very great performance of the funds in Oceania. So doing very well, reflecting the sort of trend that we've seen over the last couple of years for entities in Oceania. And with entities, I mean both funds and assets. So great work there for everyone involved. So now I'll move on to the asset model. So again, you can see that the performance overall has improved, even though, as I noted in the other slide, we don't have entirely comparable data for previous years, but roughly comparable. So you can still see the overall trends. Again, if an asset didn't complete either the performance or management score, they would get 0 for that component. So which is why you see a few entities clustered along the axes. However, the majority of assets completes both components and obtains a score for both, which allows them to be plotted into the chart. The same principles apply with the quintile lines, reflecting the GRESB rating. So this little cluster here are, I just want to point that out because I think a lot of you will probably wonder with their eyes over to that point and think, what is that? Those are a number of assets who've done very well in the performance component, but all missed out on one indicator. So if you're a little bit familiar with our assessments, there's one indicator in the performance component that has a set score. All the other indicators have a score that is dependent on the materiality of the asset. So all of those assets scored maximum points on all of the indicators except this one indicator with the set score, which is why they're all sort of along the same coordinate on the x-axis. So that's why there's this cluster over here. Great, so I think we have the same slide for Oceania, yeah. So you can see all of the assets from Oceania in this graph. And again, it's very clear that the group is doing quite well when it comes to sustainability and ESG disclosure. A lot of entities in that sort of towards that top right corner, which is exactly what we'd like to see. So we're very pleased to see that and see such a great uptake in Oceania when it comes to disclosure. Finally, we have a bit more detail on the sector participants' participation and scores. I think someone's in the background. Great. Well, we'll ignore that for the time being if there's no questions or anything like that. So the participation scores, you can see here, overall scores improved across the board, which is partially also something we saw in the previous chart with the asset model, that also the sector scores improved, which is really great to see that it wasn't just driven by increase in performance for a single sector or a single sort of location, but across the board we saw an improvement, which we're really pleased to see because it means that globally there's an increasing mandate for ESG disclosure. So that's a very positive trend. And there's a lot to unpack on this page, so I don't want to dive into too much detail because we've got a few other slides to bamboozle you with. So but just note that all of this information will be up on our website in the next week or so. So you're able to peruse all of the charts at your leisure when those get up. So just keep an eye out on GRESB.com to see when those get posted. So the next slide I wanted to show you is the, I think a very important one, is the improvement that we see in GRESB scores over the years. So obviously we now have 5 years of data and 5 years of participation in GRESB. And a really positive trend to see is that those 5th and 4th year participants are doing really well. They're really improving over time, which is fantastic to see. It's really showing that GRESB is also partially perhaps a learning experience where participants can see in the first year what sort of issues are material are flagged to them, and then improve their performance in disclosing along those issues over time, which is, I think, a really interesting thing to see, and obviously something we really need at this time. So great to see that increase in performance over time. And that's also visible in the next slide with the asset cohort scores. So the previous one obviously fund, and this one being asset. Again, we see a positive trend of entities participating and improving their scores over time, with the more mature and experienced participants doing better overall than the sort of more new participants, but still clustered close enough together to see that there's not a major disadvantage of starting as a first-year participant in GRESB, which is also good to see. So we've not made it too hard for first years to join and obtain a good score if they know what they're doing. So that's really wonderful. Now I want to close off with a few slides on our performance data, which is always very interesting, I know, for a lot of participants to see. And as we mature over time and we have a longer data set, we can get more confident about the data that we're reporting and seeing. So we'll take you along with that. So these are the indicators from our performance component for the asset assessment. So for fund, we don't collect this data just at the asset level. So we have a number of indicators that we collect quantitative data on: energy, GHG emissions, air pollution, water, waste, biodiversity and habitat, and health and safety. And we're collecting some sort of both qualitative and quantitative data also on employees and customers, but we're not presenting that here because that's a bit more of a mixed sort of data set. So here, this is purely the entities, the indicators where there's quantitative data that also includes targets, which I'll show you to the next slide. So as you can see, we have the 2019 data here on the left-hand side, and then the 2020. So what we're showing here are the number of entities that are able to report this data, for whom this data is material. So as I said, we have materiality imposed for all participants in the asset assessment, and that affects their performance reporting. So for example, water is a material indicator in terms of inflows if you are based in a location that draws water from a scarce region, so water scarce region. So that's sort of the tool that we use to assess whether you should report on it. If it's something that's not material, you're still welcome to report on it, but you're not scored on it. So it's really giving assets the opportunity to focus on those indicators that are most material, most relevant to their investors, without having to worry that they can't report on something that they think is material, but we don't have included in our materiality assessment for them. So the materiality tool that underlies this is very helpful in focusing their attention towards the most meaningful indicators. So energy is material for everybody, so that does see quite a lot of response. Also, it's an indicator that a lot of entities have a very mature reporting process for. Similarly, GHG emissions are reported very well. But what's really positive, and you can see this across the board, is that the improvement in number of entities reporting to the indicator has increased year on year for almost all of them, with the exception of the single indicator for employees, which is the lost time injury frequency rate over here, which is the only one that has slightly decreased. I don't know exactly why that's happened, but overall we have seen a great improvement. So that is a very positive trend. Perhaps this is partially due to some changes in the reporting methodology that we had this year, but we don't know exactly why fewer participants are reporting this, but that's something to unpack maybe as we sort of dive further and further into this data. So I realize we're running a little bit over time, so I'll go through the next two slides very quickly. So Ruben also still has a chance to speak. So what I just showed you was reporting of current year data. We also request information on the reporting year target that entities have set. And again, we see an increase across the board in terms of the ability to report such a target, which is fantastic. This is for the scored metric, by the way, so that's just something to note. And then finally, we also see an improvement in the number of entities that are able to report a future year target. So this can be either in the medium or long term, so any target that's not the reporting year essentially. And again, a great improvement in number of entities that are able to report that, which is great because it really shows that the industry is starting to look forward more rather than just reporting on a current year and reporting the data that is. It's also looking towards the future and thinking about what the data and performance should be towards the future, which is really wonderful. So I hope I didn't run too much over time, Ruben. I'll hand over to you if that's all right.
Sure. I'll improvise on this one very quickly about our public disclosure data set. So compared to the assessment, which typically covers performance, we also collect the data set ourselves based on publicly available information around transparency on the ESG topics and indicators that are part of the assessment. So if you look at the next slide, please. So globally, our index covers around, thank you, over 200 listed infrastructure assets with a combined value of 2.5 trillion US dollar. And what we're trying to do here is indeed define the transparency on material ESG disclosures within the industry. And it's interesting to see that actually in Australia, again, typically there's a quite high level of transparency in terms of many listed companies, listed assets performing at the top level of transparency, level A. What's also important to notice here is that we will shortly launch an investable index in collaboration with GLIO, so the Global Listed Infrastructure Organization, and GPR. And that index will be provided to investors to make a distinction between, let's say, transparent companies and asset operators that disclose information, material information on a wide range of ESG topics, as also covered in the GRESB infrastructure assessment. Next slide. So what's next? What's the future of the infrastructure sector and what to expect? A very brief outlook in terms of three main trends or topics, which we'll also discuss later on with the expert panelists. So firstly, as mentioned by Ainsley, and of course we've all been hit by COVID one way or the other, but if anything, clearly the pandemic has showed us the massive impact of acute shocks on our infrastructure. And not just that, it has also reminded us that we really need to rapidly scale up investments in resilience for infrastructure. And we need to do so because it allows us to better manage and mitigate future shocks as well. As for the longer stresses, climate change now clearly is more on top of mind than ever. And not just because it impacts our infrastructure, our communities, our energy, food and water supplies, but also and importantly, because it impacts investment outcomes. And as a result, we've seen that infrastructure investors are now demanding or assessing the ability of their investee companies to plan for and respond to these, let's say, short-term and acute shocks, but also the longer-term stresses. And this is clearly illustrated this year by a 60% year-on-year growth in participation in our GRESB resilience module. We're currently finalizing the results, so stay tuned as we will release the results on our website shortly. Next slide, please. So having learned from the COVID response, we now know that taking a science-based approach to collaborative problem solving will also help us to tackle climate change. And there is reason to be hopeful as the transition to a net zero economy has already begun. While there are various global and regional efforts to define what is net zero for infrastructure, we can already start to see the first contours of leadership in our sector. For example, in this year's asset benchmark, 43 assets are already operating at net zero or have negative emissions. And perhaps unsurprisingly, most of those assets obviously are renewables. But in addition, another 48 assets have set net zero targets, as alluded just now by Kathy. So we clearly have a long way to go looking at, let's say, the number of assets that are covered by the benchmark. But I would certainly say this is a very promising start. Next slide, please. So going forward, it will be important to look at what specific infrastructure assets need to do, not just in terms of being more resilient, but also how to cope with all kinds of related net zero challenges in order to reduce their negative impacts, but also to improve their positive impacts. You can think, for example, about reducing embodied carbon or having a more positive impact on the local communities that the assets serve. So it's clear that the pandemic, as well as the net transition, have created an urgency for asset owners to pursue responsible investments, but also to contribute to the solutions for these challenges, and at the same time generate positive environmental and social outcomes. And in response to this, we co-developed the SDG ESG Infrastructure Investment Framework. I know that's quite a long name, but the framework aims to measure an asset's contribution to those sustainable development goals that are relevant and material to the asset. And we're pretty excited because the framework will be launched this Friday. So yeah, we're looking forward to finally see this project come to life. And importantly, GRESB will also create an SDG contribution report for all assets participating in the GRESB benchmark. And the report can be used for communication to investors or other shareholders and stakeholders, obviously, following a globally recognized and standardized approach. And we believe this will bring the world one step closer to achieving the SDGs. Next slide, please. So, as Katie mentioned, 2020 was pretty extraordinary. And even though it's coming to a close, and many might say, finally, it doesn't mean that it's the end of our collective journey. Obviously, there's a long way to go, but we are ready as GRESB to guide and support you, the infrastructure sector, towards sustainable real assets. And now we are coming at a more or less ceremonial part of the presentation, which we can't do in person, so we're trying to improvise a bit, which is recognition of the global and regional sector leaders. Next slide, please. So while I appropriately get dressed for this occasion, and we'll announce some kind of, or we'll announce the winners with some kind of virtual drum roll. We're gonna show you the funds and the assets that have shown leadership in their sector and in their region based on this year's GRESB assessment. Next slide, please. So these are the 4 top funds in our database that obtain sector leadership, including Macquarie here in Australia. So again, Australia leading some of the other regions, which is really great to see. And on behalf of the full GRESB team and of course the full industry, congratulations to your leadership. Next slide, please. Then the leading asset companies and operators across all regions and also across all different sectors, including Port of Brisbane from Australia. Again, congratulations on behalf of the full GRESB team for your ESG leadership. Next slide, because finally it is not just about leading the way, but also about a journey. This year we introduced a new category, namely the Most Improved Award, in terms of those companies, funds, assets that made considerable improvement in their like-for-like GRESB performance and scores. So again, congratulations to everyone for your continuous commitment and improvement. Hooray. Now, thank you for your attention. Back to you, Arvind.
Thanks, Ruben. Thanks, Ruben. I think what a good segue for the panel that we are going to have in a moment now. All right words, net zero, resilience, and science-based targets leading to the achievement of sustainable development goals. So I'm really excited and honored to moderate this panel discussion. And during the course of next 25 minutes, we are restricted now. We went slightly over. Our panelists, who are well-known names in sustainability and responsible investment, will be sharing insights on sustainability megatrends, including SDGs, resilience, net zero pathways, and ESG frameworks and tools. So just a few housekeeping. We'll start the discussions by asking a few questions to the panelists and then open the floor for questions. So please feel encouraged to post your questions via the chat function. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce our first panelist, Ainsley Simpson. Ainsley actually doesn't need too much of an introduction here, but I would do my work. Ainsley is Chief Executive Officer for the Infrastructure Sustainability Council of Australia, Australia's peak body for advancing sustainability in infrastructure. As an accessible leader, and I've seen that personally, Ainsley is a catalyst for collaborating change and increasing business performance and operational effectiveness. She's a member of Executive Committee Australian Sustainable Built Environment Council and member of the Advisory Board Supply Chain Sustainability School of Australia. Ainsley had made sustainable infrastructure a reality, and we are keen to hear her perspectives on reshaping infrastructure for net zero. So thank you, Ainsley, for being here. Our second panelist is Matthew Brennan, Head of Sustainability at Transurban and a board member at Infrastructure Sustainability Council of Australia. With over 20 years of sustainability experience in property and infrastructure within Australia and overseas, Matt has seen and helped contribute to the evolution of sustainability from a niche activity to a key part of company success. Matt is passionate about helping business become more sustainable and socially responsible. And at Transurban, Matt is responsible for developing and implementing sustainability strategy, which is built around 4 areas: people, planet, partnerships, and places. We're excited to hear his perspective on integration of SDGs into the business and organizational strategies. Welcome, Matt. And our third panelist is Lizelle Moorhead, partner Global Infrastructure QIC. QIC is a global diversified alternatives asset manager with over 82 billion funds under management, specializing in infrastructure, real estate, liquid strategies, private capital, and multi-asset solutions. Lizelle has a wealth of experience in managing investments, monitoring complex risks and compliance issues, and evaluating sustainability of business operations. We will learn more from Lizelle on the fund's contribution to and alignment with SDGs. So let's begin the discussion with sustainable development goals. And my question to all the panelists, what is infrastructure's role in meeting the UN SDGs, and how can rating tools assist in the decade of action for the SDGs?
Well, I might jump in, Arvind, and kick off. I think that infrastructure organizations have a vital role to play in advancing implementation of the SDGs. There are a number of SDGs which particularly relate to infrastructure, most especially the actual infrastructure goal itself, goal 9, but also sustainable cities and communities where our infrastructure assets are actually situated. So I think that there are increasing expectations from fund managers and investors on asset owners and operators to make sure that they actually address the SDGs. And I think that's a really positive move that we've seen very recently, because I think the more questions that get asked of asset owners and operators, the more attention and actual outcomes we will see going forward. But I think also that there is a need for greater collaboration across the infrastructure sector in terms of understanding what each organization can do to advance implementation of the goals in certain areas. And one specific example I'd like to call out is ISCA's Modern Slavery Roads Construction Sector Coalition, where a number of road organizations have got together to share their experiences and understanding about addressing modern slavery requirements. And so I think that that's a good example and bodes well for the future, I think.
Thanks, Matt. I think you touched upon, right aspects, and goal 9 is up in center. Lizel, my question to you: how can funds assist, funds and assets invest in or contribute and align with SDGs?
Arvind, I think as Matt said, one of the core things is understanding how they can play a role. And I think it's the SDGs provide a really important framework for understanding the economic, social, environmental impact of the business. And so I think it's very much centered around understanding not just how they can contribute to SDG 9, but many of the other broader SDGs as well in how they operate their business. I guess just to give an example, from our perspective, what we've done is seek to map the portfolio to the SDGs to determine, how they can either, are we deliberately investing in the delivery of some of the SDGs? How can the investments that we make contribute to them? And then for those assets that are much more established or longer term investments that we have, really working with the businesses to ensure that they understand how they can align their business operations to delivering the SDGs. So I think the SDGs provide a really great framework for businesses to articulate that, broader thinking of their economic, social, and environmental impact.
Thanks, Lizel. Ainsley, my question to you, this is more on the third-party assurance and consistent data across regions. So what are the benefits of having this consistent data across regions, signing up to SDGs, UN SDGs? So if you can throw some light on the data and consistency.
Sure, Arvind, and maybe going back to your overarching role about the importance of infrastructure and what its role is, I think infrastructure is the great enabler. It's the fundamental building block for a vibrant society. So how we govern the planning, delivery, and operation of those assets is pretty fundamental, because it, as Lizel and Matt have both mentioned, this really goes to how the impacts of social, economic, and environmental dependencies play out, and whether those are negative or positive consequences. So from my perspective, I think that infrastructure can deliver social, cultural, environmental, and economic benefits, and I think all infrastructure can do that. At ISCA, what we believe is that the only way to do that is by measuring what matters, and using a yardstick that appropriately aligns with our universal blueprint, which is the SDGs, and keeping those top of mind is equally fundamental. How can rating tools help? Well, rating tools that are third-party assured, be they the ICE rating scheme or any of our counterparts globally that stand shoulder to shoulder, that align with the SDGs, deliver credible performance outcomes. The ICE rating scheme is an example where we've got $165 billion worth of capital value under rating. That amasses quite an incredible amount of consistent data on which to inform decision-making and action-taking on sustainable performance as we're heading to 2030. So using rating tools like the ICE rating scheme, which aligns with 15 of the 17 goals, means that at an asset level, you have granular metrics on whole of life performance. You're using a tool that drives and rewards continuous improvement in sustainability performance. And you have a tool which builds sustainability as a culture, all the while fostering innovation. So another important element of that is the economic return on investment that you get from using rating tools. And a recent study that we've done into the ICE rating scheme has found conservatively that for every dollar of cost invested in an asset undertaking a rating, as much as $2.40 is returned. Now, that excludes outcomes that are less easy to monetize, things like social impact, place-based value, and human capital development. So from my perspective, it makes the business case clear. Sustainability and profitability are not mutually exclusive.
Thanks, Hensley. I think you rightly put that sustainability and the infrastructure sector plays a big role in ensuring those sustainable outcomes and also, achievement of SDGs and alignment of SIS 15 goals. So I'm just moving from the strategic to, very specific net zero pathway. And my question to Matt is, how are infrastructure assets taking steps to meet the transition to a net zero future? And what are the key strategies to consider across different scopes, scope 1, 2, and 3? And I'm asking this question because many a times scope 3 is considered maybe not very relevant or directly applicable. So just wanted to hear your perspective on that.
Thanks, Arvind. And I'll just start off with that last point that you've made there. Scope 3 is by far and away, I believe, and many of my colleagues would agree with me, I'm sure, has the greatest opportunity for impact across our sector. And that's simply because usually an organization's own emissions are substantially lower than those from its supply chain. So in our case, our scope 1 and 2 emissions are about a quarter of those of our indirect emissions. So it's absolutely vital that we have strong engagement with our suppliers to understand what's their current thinking around emissions reduction. Are they contemplating net zero ambitions, or are they, or have they set science-based targets, for example? And then that forms a very firm foundation for engagement and collaboration going forward. And that's really, I think, the trick here. And that's where there needs to be considerable focus going forward. Because the key strategies for scope 1 reduction, so your direct emissions, for an organization like ours and for many infrastructure organizations, it comes down to your electricity consumption and also, if you have a fleet, your use of fuel. So as far as fuel is concerned, eventually we'll be moving towards electric vehicles or zero emission vehicles. So that should ultimately be taken care of. Hopefully we'll get some considerable progress before 2030. As far as energy or electricity is concerned, many corporates are either generating their own behind the meter with renewable energy installations, or and most commonly taking up power purchase agreements for renewable energy. And that's certainly what we've done, and we'll be doing a lot more of that. And I think those two key strategies are going to make a world of difference in terms of scope 1 and 2 emissions and be readily achievable. But there needs to be some discipline and a little bit of patience and forbearance in terms of the scope 3 emissions and the engagement with supply chain. But I think importantly, those efforts will be recognised through indeed the GRESB assessment, and also through as far as new assets that are being developed or built, or indeed operating assets. There will also be recognition through schemes like the Infrastructure Sustainability Rating Scheme hosted by ISCA.
Thanks, Matt. That's really insightful. I'll just jump from the core infrastructure to the funds and asset. And my question to you, Lizzle, how is this decarbonization trend reflected in practice with fund or asset management and investee engagement approaches? If you can throw some light on that.
Thanks, Arvind. Very aligned with what Matt just talked to. And I think, I guess as an investment manager managing large amounts of capital invested in infrastructure assets, our objective is to deliver, bringing it back to, ultimately it's about building resilient and adaptable portfolios. So in order to do that, we really do need to understand the transition risk and understand how across the portfolio we can take action to build in the mitigations, or at least a deep understanding of how to take action to contribute to the reduction of greenhouse gas emissions over time. So this is a real focus from our asset management approach and our direct engagement with each of our portfolio companies. And it's quite a challenge with 19 different assets in a variety of sectors, each with their own shareholding and other dynamics, geographies. So I guess what we've need to try and do is really take a very pragmatic, fit-for-purpose approach to sustainability, and also in how we look at net zero emissions, but always with that ultimate target of building resilience into the businesses. So we have undertaken a project this year of really focusing on how we can work towards a net zero emissions target of aspirationally 2030 across the portfolio. But in order to do that, we have to work with each of the portfolio companies to really baseline, first of all, understand the emissions for each of the assets, what's driving them. We've focused immediately on scope 1 and scope 2, but we have sought to measure scope 3 for each of the assets because, strategically, we can't ignore scope 3. It's really what the broader strategic drivers of the business and how trends over the longer term. So now that we've got that baseline, the next stage of engagement is really to work with each of the portfolio assets to develop a net zero emissions pathway. As I said, across the different businesses, we have different levels of maturity. Some already have set that target and are working happily towards that. Others need more direct engagement and assistance in working towards it. And some are going to be easier than others to hit that target, and some may not get to 2030, but we're certainly pushing to ensure that the analysis is there, because fundamentally what's really, really important is that the businesses understand the risk and are working out what that might, what that impact of that risk is on their business, and then how can they manage a pathway to mitigate it. So really that's our objective. It's not a project that's complete. It will continue to iterate. It's very much revolves around developing over time and new technologies coming along, as mentioned, EVs and the like. So it's going to be an ongoing project.
Absolutely. So that takes me to Ainsley. Ainsley, what insights can you share from the Reshaping Infrastructure to Net Zero paper that if you can share some insights, that would be really useful.
Sure, thanks, Arvind. Well, I might give you 3 helicopter highlights from the Reshaping paper, and I'll after this post on LinkedIn the links so that you can engage with it if you'd like to. The first highlight is that 70% of Australia's emissions are enabled by infrastructure. So much like what Matt and Liesl have mentioned, that there is huge opportunity here. Of that, 6% is from embodied emissions, 9% is from operational emissions, but 55% is enabled from the emissions by transport, electricity, and gas. So it's end user interface. The second highlight is that from an emissions reduction perspective, emissions reduction is not effectively prioritized in decision-making processes at any stage of the life cycle, and that there is no consistent process or formalized process to translate goals into action. The third finding is that the greatest potential for decreasing emissions is during the business case or the decision-making stage, when, what, and where and how we decide to address infrastructure problems. So investors and financiers, be they private or public, have a central role to play. So the clear takeout is that coupled with the ROI work, the Net Zero paper highlights that sustainable infrastructure can lay the foundations not only for our economic recovery, but also for our net zero future. And while there is incredible risk, I personally believe that infrastructure is probably our greatest net zero opportunity.
Thanks, Ainsley. I think I agree with you on the scale of emissions that infrastructure sector contributes to and has potential in the net zero pathway. So that takes me to the science-based targets which Matt had been discussing. So what is the role of the science-based targets regarding GHG emission reduction for infrastructure owners and operators? Very quickly, and this question is for all the panelists.
I would say they have a massive role. I mean, it's if you're an organisation that's committed to addressing the recommendations of the task force for climate-related financial disclosures, they are a vital tool to achieve the transition to a low-carbon future. Without such a robust pathway as is represented through the targets, organizations will be floundering and have a whole range of different directions. What the science-based targets process does is actually ensure that there's a robust methodology and that the actual emission reductions are going to be real and meaningful, and hopefully reflect through in some actual physical outcomes before too long.
Thanks, Matt. Any insights, Ainsley or Lizelle?
Oh, look, I was just going to take a slightly different approach, because we definitely looked at the science-based targets versus net zero emissions, and probably came with a hybrid that we want a science-based approach that has the rigor. But I think in terms of communicating the objective, we found working with a net zero emissions target an easier one to work with, but absolutely agree with you, Matt, in terms of not ensuring that using a science-based rigorous approach is really important.
Lisa, I think they're probably complementary, aren't they? I mean, you can have both running at the same time, but net zero is definitely an easier communications task, and everyone understands, well, pretty much everyone understands what we're trying to achieve.
That's right. So I'm just conscious of time. My questions on the risk and impact and also the partnerships. So this question is to all of you. How do we address physical and transition risk, and how can we meet disclosure expectations such as TCFD recommendations? So maybe Lizelle, you can start by answering this question first.
Sure. Look, for infrastructure assets, the physical risk of climate change are obviously really material as well, or at least at until we've done the materiality assessment. But I think it really comes back to that same process of doing the assessment and deep dive and understanding the material impacts of the likely impacts of climate change on the physical infrastructure itself. It's very geographic and location specific and relation to the particular assets, but it's a really important process to go through to really, and it drives strategy as well as sort of ongoing management to make sure we're optimizing the infrastructure over the longer term. I think the TCFD provides a recognized framework for structuring that approach that's then provides a degree of consistency. So, I mean, I think it's a very helpful framework for particularly the businesses to use to begin to understand, putting that, that framework around what climate risk is for the particular business in question.
Lisa, I might just jump in with another reflection there. From a physical risk point of view, I think the complexity of the challenge shouldn't be underestimated. And it's going to be a process which is going to take some years until, for example, we get to the point where we can have very clear understanding of the financial impacts on assets. So to give you a specific example, looking at customer behavior in periods of increased rainfall, will they actually drive more or less? And can they even get onto a particular asset if another one leading to it is underwater? So there's a need to do very granular analyses for each individual asset, as you've mentioned, in each geographic market, and then in combination, in consultation with the key stakeholders as well, to understand their thoughts on mitigation.
If I might add, firstly, a disclosure. SDG 17 is my favorite SDG. Which is all about partnerships. So I might just touch on three things where I think the how might be useful. The first on those physical risks is some time back we did an assessment of mapping how state climate action strategies marry up with some of the ICE rating framework. But the key findings that came out is that all of those strategies call on climate risk assessment, but there is no suppository for data. There is currently no opportunity for cumulative impact assessment of the various assets that we have, and we know how interdependent assets are and the importance that they have on city and regional resilience. The second is that there is highly variable scenario modelling taking place, but that's not necessarily shared. So I would suggest that on the physical risk side of things, one of the greatest opportunities is that there is more transparency in some of the modelling, not necessarily the risk and the financial implications, which can be highly commercially sensitive, but at least on some of those modelling parameters and the kind of scenarios that we're using. On the transition risk, I think that there's opportunity in the policy area. And that's particularly because I think that there needs to be a market-led leap and consistent message in what's appropriate and how that gets signaled, rather than multiple different voices saying slightly different things when we need to firm up gaps in our federal policy. And the last thing might be on reputational risk. And that's really just noting that I think there is an increasing shift in the importance of genuine and regular engagement with stakeholders and how you're communicating, addressing these risks. And noting that it's happening, I think is probably a giant step in the right direction.
Yep, thanks. Thanks, Ainsley. I think all right things and right indicators that we discussed. So thank you very much for your wonderful insights. So now I open the floor for questions, and I see there are a couple of questions in the chat window, and we wanted them to be in the Q&A, but never mind. I would just read out a few questions. The first one is from Hiresh Devasa from GHD. This is for Lizelle and Matt. Will organizations like QIC and Transurban start to prefer seeking advice from consultants that have achieved net zero emissions? Is this a strong consideration?
I can speak. I mean, maybe Matt is better to speak to this. It's not something that we've contemplated at the moment, but I think as Matt raised is, I can't remember where I read, but as more and more people move to a commitment to net zero, you do wonder whether you do create a supply chain of net zero. So I think that, perhaps that is something in the future that will be something to be considered.
I agree, Liesl. I think that that will happen over time. And, as we've started to have collaboration with our suppliers, we've been very positively surprised that many of those have already got net zero ambitions or have signed up to the science-based targets or indeed are carbon neutral. So that's fantastic. So look, I think yes, to the question, it's probably just a matter of time before that starts to happen.
Thanks for that. And the other question here, and I think this should be the last question because we are running way over the allocated time. So this is from Brett Mish. I'm sorry if I don't pronounce your name correctly. So this is for all the panelists. I note that CMSI is attempting to coordinate standard approaches to scenarios for the Australian landscape. What is your take on this to respond to Ainsley's point regarding database for climate modeling?
Thanks, Brett. I might just weigh in there. I think that those kind of initiatives where there is a drive for greater collaboration and consistency is really helpful. And I also note that the CSIRO is looking at how they might start providing more greater guidance around the kind of scenarios that get modelled and the kind of input factors. So I certainly support those kind of initiatives, and it's something that we will integrate into our frameworks.
From a company point of view, I'd certainly welcome it because a lot of smaller organizations in particular don't have the resources to undertake a significant work in the scenario building area. So I think that will be a terrific removal of a barrier that exists currently to TCFD reporting.
Yeah, So I think with this, I would invite all the participants to join me in thanking our esteemed panelists. I have certainly found this session to be very informative and insightful, and I trust that all the participants, even you, share the same feelings. So as I mentioned earlier, the recording and results will be available on GRESB website for your reference. So I now hand over to the panel 2, and thank you again, Ensley, Matt, and Lizelle.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Arvind. It was a very insightful and fascinating panel session. Let's see if we can get, there we go. Awesome. There's more to come. I mean, this was truly insightful and fascinating insights, but there is more to come. And again, as a reminder, I would like to invite all attendees to ask their questions in the Q&A button that should be somewhere here on your screens, not sure. So before we dive in, allow me to briefly introduce the 2 distinguished panelists in random order, by the way, so no preference there. But I'll start with Talia Williams, who is Head of Investment Stewardship at Victorian Funds Management Corporation, VFMC. Talia leads the responsible investment function, setting the strategic direction for the fund's investment stewardship practices. She also sits on the investment leadership team and the investment committee. Interestingly, that's what you do if you look on LinkedIn, Talia was an environmental project manager for Shell almost 2 decades ago. So let's see if we can hear more about that interesting experience later on. And besides the many other interesting hobbies that Talia has, she's also a member of the technical working group of the Australian Sustainable Finance Initiative, SV. Welcome, Talia. And secondly, we have Lucy Tommins, Head of Investment Stewardship at New South Wales Treasury Corporation, T Corp. In the investment leadership team, Lucy has accountability for the design and implementation of T Corp's portfolio-wide investment and stewardship portfolio approach and philosophy. Lucy uses a 5-pillar framework to embed stewardship across the organization, and I would definitely like to hear more about what that framework is about, including the 5 pillars, obviously. Lucy's career spans various global investment roles, and she's passionate about using ESG integration in active ownership. What a panel. Again, welcome both ladies. Let's dive right in. We already heard from the previous panel around how investment managers, such as QIC, but also operators, such as Transurban, are coping with all kinds of shocks, more specifically the current pandemic, but also are trying to prepare and adapt to longer term stresses such as climate change. So my question to you is how you typically assess the impact of these kind of risks on your indirect investment portfolio, but also how you assess or evaluate the ability of your investment managers to cope, manage, and mitigate with these risks. And I would like to start with Talia.
Yeah, sure. So thank you. And it's great to see everyone here today and some familiar names in the attendees list. In terms of the approach that we have at VFMC, we haven't specifically spent a lot of time sort of looking in terms of what the impact, for example, of COVID may have been on the assets at a really granular level. What we're trying to understand is how those assets and the various companies will be building resilience into their operations moving into the future, because we really want to see that those assets, which are really long-lived, are resilient from an environmental perspective, but also from a social perspective, because what the COVID pandemic in particular has done is highlight the extreme levels of vulnerability that were present in the economic system, and we want to ensure that those vulnerabilities are rectified and remedied in a fair and equitable manner. So Lucy, maybe over to you for your comments.
Yeah, thanks Talia, and thank you Ruben. I absolutely echo that sentiment around that COVID has highlighted that fragility of our ecosystem, if you like, and the importance of the different parts of that system, whereas once before they may not have been considered, major drivers of different parts of the business model. The one part that stands out is the human capital side. And no doubt there are plenty of people in the responsible investment community who are high-fiving and air punching with the small silver lining that that is a topic that's getting more attention than it did previously. And there's nothing like this shock to really emphasize and bring that out. Certainly we saw both across our listed and unlisted exposures, the attention over the last few months has been all on financial capital management and human capital management. There hasn't always been a lot of time for anything else, unless you happen to be in an industry that's experiencing some growth off the back of the pandemic. But for all the others, that has been the priority that has taken all of the board attention. And I think that engagement that people are getting both with employees tends to be first, clients, community, and then society, and an understanding of the engagement and what their needs are is probably, I hope, going to bring us out stronger on the other side. So I think we still don't have all of the tools, certainly as portfolio managers, to understand all of those impacts. But what we've certainly seen at the individual organization and asset level, there's this a better understanding and higher desire to measure and monitor some of those areas.
And if I may add to what Lucy has said, one of the other critical things is that, and I'm sure T Corp has also been doing this, we've been looking at how assets and companies have responded, and it's a really good means by which to gauge the quality of the asset and the management team, and not necessarily just in the context of infrastructure, but we've seen some entities respond really, really well, and we've seen others that have not responded so well, and that then really calls into question broader governance mechanisms and the overall quality of the particular investment.
And if you talk about responding, is that using, let's say, a predefined reporting framework, or are those responses more coming from, let's say, direct interaction and engagement with those managers? How do you collect that kind of material information and data about your investments?
So it's through that direct interaction, and then observing what's happening in the media, interaction with peers, and also through other collaborative initiatives. And the focus in the very immediate term was looking at, going to what Lucy mentioned regarding human capital management, was how companies were looking after their workers, ensuring that they had security of income and that they were remaining safe.
Yeah,
and to Talia's point, it would be that, you know, another example outside of, say, just employees would be around other stakeholder relationships like government. So for some industries, the strength of the relationship with government, and indeed the strength of the entity's relationship with government, allowed them to respond really quickly, because they could navigate, okay, what are we allowed to do in this very new environment? And how do we get our employees to work, or how do we continue our services? And if they had that strength of relationship and trust, that strong engagement, they were able to get there faster. So that, you know, all of those kind of stakeholder relationships that we've emphasized for years were really, really brought to the fore in this pandemic. And only through good board leadership, I would suggest, a good executive, but in particular board leadership, were they able to act on those different areas of need.
And where do you see the biggest challenges in terms of, you know, getting to that level of understanding, first and foremost, probably by active engagement, but also then being able to potentially influence some kind of behavior that should lead to more aligned outcomes, or let's say positive behavior in line with what you're expecting?
Yeah, sure. I think the challenge is, as large investors, we have such broad exposures, so it's difficult to sort of be across everything. So it's really sort of trying to take a materiality-based approach and focus on those investments where you have the greatest visibility and you can influence, and where the risk lies.
Yeah, I suppose one of the way we would think about it is a little bit around, so governance becomes very critical, and this is always generally for the, you know, the due diligence and the setup at the start of going into an opportunity. And so the degree of influence tends to be very much related to the two things, I suppose: the ownership rights or control rights that you get, as well as the alignment of the manager, or indeed if it's direct, with the senior executives of the organization. And so that where we get those right, or where they're stronger, we have more ability to nudge things forward and also then to respond to changes, because what we've seen is this continuous resetting of the benchmark every year across sustainability, which is wonderful, but you know, it means that there's always a new aspirations and new goals to head for. And so if we've got that you know, degree of control or influence as well as alignment, we find that's the perfect recipe for change.
Yeah.
And it's particularly evident in the infrastructure space. So for example, VFMC has 7 key infrastructure managers, so it's a manageable number of managers, and we can build strong collaborative relationships with those managers and can engage with them sensibly, because you know, there's only 7 of them, and it's possible to do that. And then through that engagement and that collaboration, understand what's happening on the ground, how various risks are being managed, and then identify areas where we do want to see a drive and continuous improvement.
Yeah, and obviously that level of engagement and influence is easier when it's a non-public or non-listed company or asset. How does it relate to, let's say, to your listed investment portfolio in let's say infrastructure equities or listed companies? Because I can imagine, yeah, it's a different way of engagement and also making sure that alignment is being realized.
Well, it's been an interesting year. Yeah, I'm happy to jump in on that one. It's been a very interesting year certainly on the listed side in Australian equities, for example, where I would say most of the funds is where they do most of their direct engagement, if they're going to do direct engagement in Australia. We've moved from, I'd say, 3 big trends. One is a higher use of ownership rights. So we're seeing much higher proportions of votes against management at AGMs, and also just number of engagements, according, you know, anecdotally from the board directors are saying they're doing. The second would be around more commitments. We've seen more commitments from corporates around climate, you know, the net zero heroes and all of the different sustainability commitments that they're making. But then the last one will be around the accountability to those commitments. And we've seen that massively through Rio, AMP, you know, there's no shortage of examples this year where companies are actually taking action and making, you know, making sure that there's accountability for some of the issues that investors have concerns about and rightly have concerns about. So there's been a big change over the last few years in how I think corporates are responding to the direct engagement that's happening, both from sell side, buy side, and the asset owners. So it's across the board.
Yeah, and we're also seeing companies that would not typically have engaged specifically on ESG related matters more proactively reaching out to investors. So a few years ago, it was typically the ASX 50 that were very, very good at engaging with their stakeholders on ESG. And we're now seeing that level of outward bound engagement moving down the cap spectrum, because even the smaller companies are realising that they do need to manage their social licence to operate and to engage with their investors on those issues. And going to the issue of accountability, particularly from a proxy voting perspective, we're also seeing, particularly in the remuneration votes, consideration of how companies have responded to COVID and how they've performed in the context of COVID, and then checking on whether that aligns with the remuneration outcomes, the shareholder experience and the community experience. And investors are voting against remuneration reports where there is that lack of alignment.
Okay, let's turn to one of the questions that was submitted via the Q&A. You can still do so if you're an attendee. This question is from Kieran Haikinen, who's asking what emerging social trends will become a new focus for infrastructure investors, owners, and rating schemes. And I guess, you know, when we look at social, indeed, it's more than just, let's say, health and well-being. It's also about safety. Of course, here in Australia, we have the Modern Slavery Act and so on. Any views on that? What will become, let's say, the next big trend in let's say, social issues, looking at responsible investments for infrastructure?
Like going to one of the issues that Lucy raised, it's cultural heritage, and that is particularly relevant in the context of an infrastructure, given the physical footprint that infrastructure assets can have, whether you're looking at pipeline companies in the US or various other infrastructure assets. And I think, particularly in Australia, we've been pretty slow to act responsibly regarding cultural heritage, and what occurred at Rio Tinto has really thrust a spotlight on that area of practice. And then there's a range of other issues, but I've spoken a lot on cultural heritage, so Lucy, you might like to speak about some other issues.
Oh, I totally agree with that one, Talia. Just transition. I think that will be. The next one of the next big social topics over the next few years across all of Australia, not just necessarily the infrastructure assets. I also think there will be a more emphasis, as one of my observations will be that assets are using more and more data and trying to move towards a more of a data-centric model, I suppose, to drive their cost analysis and etc. And I think that only those who've done that or have been ahead on that find it only works then if they engage with either their communities or employees or tenants, if it's real estate, for example, to shape behavior. So that's that's an example around energy, but around water, etc. So I think that coupling what the data tells them and the systems they build with how they engage to change behaviors is going to be a theme. And so the social aspect of that is how do they measure and monitor and assess those behaviors and feel like that they're on the right track with those issues.
Yeah, and another key social area is diversity and inclusion. So we're obviously seeing that coming out of the COVID crisis, there will be an infrastructure-led recovery, and often that industry has potentially been more male-dominated. So it's important to ensure that the industry does become more inclusive from the asset management level right down through to people working on the ground at those assets.
Great. Talking on data, of course, ESG data, if you look at the different metrics and measures that are being used across, let's say, the infrastructure sectors and regions, I guess lots of different data sets, different definitions and so on. At the same time, as we showed, there is absolutely an increasing number of asset operators that are collecting, let's say, specific metrics, which you can use to determine, let's say, the outcomes, either good or bad. What do you think are the biggest challenges in relation to data comparability? So comparing one asset to another, comparing an apple to an apple, another pineapple, so to say.
Yeah, well, first, let me say, Ruben, just congrats to GRESB on another great year of progress and pushing the boundaries on making sure that we are getting availability of data, and as investors and users, that's incredibly important. The challenge then becomes at a total portfolio level across different asset classes, how you use that data to tell you something about the total portfolio. And it really ties back to the first thing we started talking about, was how do you build in resilience to shocks and change. And so, the traditional investment theory is that you need diversification across your portfolio. And indeed, you need diversification across ESG as well, or certainly that's how we think about it at T Corp. You need diversification across multiple different risk lenses, and ESG is one of those. And so when we think about adding a new asset, for example, to the portfolio, we want to think about what does this do to our overall climate risk? What does this do to our overall kind of governance benchmark that we have across the portfolio? And is that acceptable? Is it adding, is it additive to the whole portfolio? Which is fine within an asset class, but then really, really tricky when you start comparing it to different asset classes. And I can't say we've fully reconciled that yet. Some metrics are maybe more easier than others, like something like carbon, but even that has its issues. So I think for the moment, we're resorting to things like dashboards that tell us about trends, that tell us about what we think are acceptable levels, rather than, because we're finding it difficult to get that consistency and comparability across asset classes on ESG specific data. And what's material for one, as everyone is very aware, what's material for one area is not necessarily for another. So we want to make sure we're measuring the right things.
Sure. And adding to what Lucy has said, one of the challenges is the resourcing levels at asset owners to analyse that data. And so from a VFMC perspective, what we're really focused on is understanding what are the risks facing a particular asset or manager, and then having a clear understanding of how those risks are being managed, and then ensuring that there is data that sits behind that. So we're not at the point where we can be managing vast quantities of data, and you can start drowning in data sometimes. So it's really critical to have that data there and know it's there and know it's rigorous, because that then underpins the analysis that we do. But it's sort of, our focus is really on that understanding of what the risks are and how they're being managed.
Thank you. Being conscious of time, perhaps a last question already. Just a random one. Obviously, there's lots of movement within, let's say, governments around the globe in terms of policies regarding ESG implementation, disclosures, regulations, certainly when looking at, let's say, the EU and their taxonomies. What do you expect, and perhaps you can use the Australian context in terms of the federal government. You're also free to use the US context where things seems to be changing, hopefully in the right direction. How do you see, what is the role of governments, and how might that help you better understand and also for your investments to better align with, let's say, responsible investment principles, but also indeed solving some of the larger challenges, including obviously climate change and the transition to net zero? Lucy?
I can give a really quick answer. Oh, sorry, you go, Lucy. You go.
Go ahead.
No, you go. That's all right.
So if we think about something like climate, some of the key drivers I would think about are policy, technology, and consumer behavior. Or corporate consumer social behavior. And so I think the key role, and the fourth then would be around the capital flows to stitch all of that together. So I think the key role for certainly the engagements I have at state government level would be around policy and the financial flows. We've certainly, as you mentioned, Ruben, seen huge increase, exponential growth in regulation in the last couple of years. 53% of global GDP now has net zero targets, and 5 or 6 countries have that in law. So that's moving quickly. So for many businesses, if you want to do business in those countries, you're going to need to get your house in order. And then the other is around the financial capital, or the capital flows. We've certainly seen the green bond, or the sustainability bond market has tipped $2 trillion now. Again, exponential growth there, and we've seen that year on year. But it's not off this tiny base it was anymore. It's growing quickly. So I think that's where government can play a role around policy and financial capital.
Excellent.
Yeah, so I agree with that enabling policy environment. And perhaps just on reporting, I think reporting is really important, but we also need to be focused on impact on the ground. And I think that's one of the challenges we've seen with TCFD reporting, because lots of companies are reporting in accordance with the TCFD framework, but companies can tailor that to meet their needs, and they all have favourable outcomes for themselves. And what we really need to be seeing is not only a transition to net zero, but we need to be seeing businesses and companies transforming. And I think there's a focus on transition, and what we really need to be seeing is transformation, and reporting only gets us so far.
Interesting. Well, that's a good thought to take back home virtually. Talia, Lucy, thank you very much. A really insightful panel, and I'm sure that the attendees agree with me. I think that's it. I would like to give the final word back to Arvind.
Thanks, Ruben. So that brings us to the end of the session. And quickly summing up, I think, I would like to share some keywords that came out in both the panels. The first panel, we did hear about sustainability and the business case. We, saw that panelists talking about the net zero and science-based target. It's not either or, but it's basically in sync. And then importance of risk framework and the TCFD. So how these kind of frameworks or risk rating tools, they work as a kind of a guideline for achieving the sustainability outcomes. And I think in the second panel, the takeaways for me was, importance of transparency and right disclosures, collaboration and engagement, how that really helps in achieving what we are set out to achieve, and importance of policy and the enabling environment to achieve those carbon maybe carbon commitments, I would say, or the adaptation or adapting to the ever evolving climate risks that we are set out to. So I think it was really both the sessions were very insightful, and I would like to thank all the esteemed panelists who took time off and shared their insights, and I'm sure all the participants, you found this session really useful. And reminding again, the recording and results will be available on GRESB site. And thank you all again for attending today. Thank you so much, Ruben.
Thank you too, Arvind. Thank you all.